Good, so do turn to Psalm 107. And like I said, we'll be focusing in on the fourth of these short stories that we have in this psalm, in this song of praise and of thanks to God. The theme of the psalm is God's love, as you can see looking at the beginning and at the end. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. That's a theme and that's a verse that appears again and again through Scripture. The reason we give thanks to God is for his steadfast and unchanging love. And when you turn to the end of the psalm, you have verse 43, whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let them consider the steadfast love of the Lord. That's what this psalm is here for. It's to help us consider what God's love is like. And these four short stories give us a view into how God's love is shown at different times to people. And the fourth one is really about how God's love is shown when we thought we didn't actually need him. If you look at the four stories, you've got one in verse 4, the people who are wandering in a desert waste, finding no way to a city to dwell in. People who are lost and hungry and thirsty and who cry to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivers them. And the second story begins in verse 10. Some who are sitting in darkness and the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons, for they've rebelled against God. And they're obviously very much aware of this, and they cry to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivers them from their distress. The third group of people, the first story comes in verse 17. Some were fools through their sinful ways, and because of their iniquities suffered affliction. They loathed any kind of food. They drew near to the gates of death. And then they cry to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivers them from their distress. Well, the fourth story starts off on quite a normal day in the life of these people. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters, and they saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. It starts off when this group of people don't think that they actually need God. They don't think that they need him. There's a group of people who are quite content with themselves, quite ordinary people going about their everyday business. They don't think that they need God. Now, of course, storms have been in the news a lot this week for one reason or another, and you've had that tragic situation with the storm of the shipwreck off Sicily, which has dominated the news. I didn't plan to talk about sea and ships because of that. I'd actually planned this out before, and this was a talk that I had to give to a couple of the lunchtime talks up in London. Usually on a Tuesday, I go up to London for work and join a group of people in St Botolph's Aldersgate, where we hold a lunchtime talk for city workers to come and hear the gospel, for Christians to be encouraged, for people to bring their friends to. And I was asked to speak on this particular passage of Psalm 107 some months ago, and that then came up this week. So it was not in response to news and events, but kind of predating that. We've had a bit of a storm this week, haven't we, ourselves? Not very much of one. We've had Storm Lillian, which has kind of blown itself out. But these things happen. Storms happen in life, and there's not much you can do to get away from them. But what we're going to see here is how this particular storm, and this story obviously has a happy ending, not a tragic one. This particular storm here is part of God's dealings with these people, and part of what his plan is for them, and how he works through this storm and everything that happens to bring about the climax of this story in verse 31 and 32. So we're going to look first of all at God's wondrous works, how the people involved in this story see God's greatness. God's wondrous works, seeing his greatness. As I said, the people in this story are ordinary traders, they're ordinary sailors, ordinary people going about their business. Some went down to the sea in ships doing business on the great waters. It's not a very safe job, but you don't go down to the sea in a ship expecting to have a dreadful storm, or you probably wouldn't go that day. These people are going about the ordinary job, taking some risks, but they're probably thinking and planning ahead as to what they're going to be doing. They're going to sail from point A to point B, probably across the Mediterranean. They're going to sell what they've got on board. They're going to buy something else. They're going to bring it back. They're going to sell it for some more money. They're going to make a profit, and then they'll do it again. And that's what they do. That's everyday day at the office, all day at the day in the ship. They're doing business on the great waters. That's what their job is. But on this particular occasion, they see, it says, the deeds of the Lord. They see his wondrous works in the deep. Up to that point, they're very much in control of their lives, in control of their destinies. They've got everything planned out. They know what they're doing. They're doing it in order to make the money that they need to support their families, to buy a new house, whatever else they've planned on the horizon, to save up for their retirement, or whatever it is. But into that everyday world of their business and what they do, and them being in control of their lives, comes something which is way outside their control. And that's what this story hangs on. The deeds, as it says here, of the Lord break into their everyday lives. And it happens simply as this storm comes up. Now, these people are quite different from the people in the three other stories. The three other stories are people who know they're under the judgment of God, or they're people who are oppressed by the sense of their sin and their guilt before God. But these people start off quite oblivious to God, quite oblivious to their sin, quite oblivious to their position in relation to God. But what strikes them first of all is not a conviction of sin. It is not a conviction of their rebellion, but it's a conviction of their helplessness, isn't it? If you look at the people back in the second story, in verse 11, they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. If you look at the people in the third story, they were fools through their sinful ways, verse 17. Because of their iniquities, they suffered affliction. But the people in this story are first struck by their helplessness, their weakness as human beings, in the face of a power which is completely outside of their control, something they can do nothing about. And you look at how they react here. They lose their courage. Just read verse 25, 26, what happens? He commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea, and they mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They lose their courage, they lose their balance, they're reeling and staggering like drunken men, and they lose their minds. They're at their wits' end. They don't know what to do about it, because here's something that's completely outside of their control. We all like to have our lives under control, don't we? We like to know what we're doing. We like to have things planned out. We like to be the ones who are setting the agenda, and then we follow through and we do what we planned, and we say, that was a good day. I managed to do everything on my to-do list. Or that was a good day. We planned this, we went there, we enjoyed that, we had a good time, we came home again, we had a good dinner, everything went smoothly. We like to be in control. But these people are hit by something which simply reminds them that they are not in control. It brings everything into perspective. Like I said, I wasn't expecting to have to deal with big news events about shipwrecks when I planned this talk, but one of the things that does is it helps us realize our helplessness, doesn't it? Mankind is helpless. Even the most powerful and the richest or the greatest people are helpless. That's you and that's me and that's everyone else on this planet. We don't really have control of our lives. And that's what these sailors and these tradesmen these business people sailing to and fro on the sea in ships to do their trading. That's what they're now realizing as they're at their wits' end. They don't know what to do with themselves. They had everything sorted. They were very clever at doing what they did, but now they've lost their minds because there's nothing they can do about this storm. It shouldn't take a big event on the news to remind us about that, should it? Because really our lives are full of things that remind us that we're not really in control. Right? Sickness, accident, things happening which we didn't plan for. Obviously the big things do remind us of that. If you remember back when COVID started happening, was it 4.5 years ago now? It's a long time ago, right? And we've all forgotten what it felt like when it started happening, because things like that we stick in that pocket out of the way because it was so uncontrolled, wasn't it, from a human perspective? We started going, oh, there's all these people getting ill in China, people dying in China. That's a long way away, right? We'll close the borders. We can control this. It won't get here. Oh, look, lots of people in Italy are very unwell. Okay, we've closed the borders. We won't let the Italians in. Have we got it under control? I remember one of the first cases, I think, was in the office next to mine, or the office building next to mine. It's like, oh, okay, people in London are getting this now. And it didn't take very long, did it, for us to realize that actually we don't have our health under control. Not nationally, not the most powerful nations on the planet cannot really control something like that. But we easily forget that feeling, don't we? Because we don't like the feeling of not being in control. And so something happens, it goes, and we forget. And we go back to feeling that our lives are in our control, and we can manage it, and we can sort it, and we're powerful enough and strong enough to get ourselves through life from one end to the other. But ultimately, these are the little everyday things, aren't there, which remind us that we're not in control. Accident, illness, death, but all things which we kind of put to one side and pretend it's not going to happen to us until it happens. Well, that's kind of what these traders have been doing, isn't it? They know that by going to sea in a ship, they're risking a storm. But now the storm comes, they're at their wits' end. They don't know what to do, because there was no way of planning and dealing with this. James talks about this in James chapter 4, as we're reading this example. He talks about people trading very confidently and very powerfully. He says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit." He says, "Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil." You probably know the story as well of Jonah, right? And Jonah and the big fish. What's Jonah doing? Jonah is trying to assert his own control over his life, isn't he? God tells Jonah, go and take this message of judgment to that city. Jonah goes, I don't want to do that, not because I disapprove of messages of judgment, but because I'd quite like those people to be judged, and I don't want them to hear about the steadfast love of the Lord. And so Jonah gets in a boat, probably not the brightest idea, and goes, I'm going to sail over to the other side of the Mediterranean to get away from God. And he goes to sleep, and he's oblivious. He thinks he's in control. Down comes the storm, and he quickly realizes that he isn't. What makes you think of a power that's on another level from you? Because this is what's happening to the people here, right? It's not just their own insignificance they're realizing. They're also realizing there's a power that's far greater than them, a person who's far greater than them, as we'll see in how they respond to what happens. A person they've tried to ignore, or perhaps even without trying, have simply ignored. The worst sin, as James says there in James chapter 4, is by ordinary people, ordinary businessmen, ordinary traders like this, who arrogantly assume that they're going to be in control of their lives. It's that arrogance against God where we assume that we have everything in control. It's not the people who are prisoners in afflictions and irons. It's not the people who are, because their iniquities suffer affliction. But ordinary people like you and me who get on with our lives, think they're sorted, and as James says, never go to themselves, well, if the Lord wills, I will live and do this or that. It's just, I'm going to do it, because who's going to stop me? I'm in control. Well, what do you do when, if like the people in this storm here in Psalm 107, you realize God's greatness? You see the wondrous works of the Lord, you see the deeds of the Lord and his wondrous works in the deep. What do you do? Well, what they do is exactly what the other three sets of people do. Then they cry to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. Which brings us on to our second point. So we've seen God's wondrous works. The second thing is God's steadfast love. They experience God's deliverance. They cried to the Lord in their trouble. Just like the people who were fools because of their sinful ways, they cried to the Lord in their trouble and he delivered them. Just like the people who were sitting in prison in affliction and irons, they cried to the Lord in their trouble and he delivered them. Just like the people wandering and lost in the desert, they cried to the Lord in their trouble and he delivered them. And we should kind of be getting the point at this stage in the psalm that regardless of your situation, if you cry to the Lord in your trouble, there's a fair chance he's going to deliver you, because that seems to be what he always does. And that's exactly what happens to these sailors. You know the story of John Newton, I'm sure. John Newton had quite a similar story to this story in Psalm 107. He was a sailor and a trader. He was involved in the slave trade as a young man and spent a lot of time at sea. At one stage he became a kind of slave himself and was rescued from that and brought back on ship to Britain. And as they were passing the coasts of Ireland, a huge storm came up. The ship was in imminent danger of sinking. And John Newton, for the first time, cried to God for mercy. He was a man who was very confident in himself, a man who was quite happy blaspheming God or ignoring God or whatever the urge took him. But he cried out to God for mercy because he realized that he was hit by something which was completely outside of his control. And his life didn't all change at once, but that was the point at which he started to understand who God was, who he was. He cried to God for salvation, he was saved, and bit by bit his life was changed. And he left the slave trade, he started to vigorously opposing it. He became a minister in London, up near where I work actually, and spent the rest of his life preaching and encouraging Christians to live out their faith and particularly in that context to oppose the slave trade and everything that was going on around it. And of course he wrote the great hymn Amazing Grace about his experience of discovering God's love, which really started there in that storm. That's the experience of these sailors here. They cry to the Lord and he delivers them, just the same as from any other situation in this psalm. And what does God do? Well, he controls what was out of their control. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. We read at the start about Jesus doing this for the disciples. The disciples were frantic. It was outside their control. The water's coming into the boat. They've tried bailing it. There's nothing they can do. The boat is going to go down. And they cry to the Lord in their trouble. And Jesus gets up and he says, "Peace, be still." And the storm stops. He made the storm be still. The waves of the sea were hushed. He controls what's outside their control. He makes them glad. They were glad that the waters were quiet. And he brings them to their destination. God has very definitely heard them and answered them, right? These people who went to sea with no force of God, they've cried to him and God's heard them. They've experienced God's love and God's deliverance for themselves. That's why this story has a happy ending. But for the men in this story, where did God's love begin? Well, it began when they saw God's wondrous works and his deeds in the deep. Where does the story of God's love begin for John Newton? Well, it begins in that storm off the coast of Ireland when he thinks that he's going down and he cries to God for deliverance. God's love begins in the storm. God's not some superhero that you call on, right? You don't pick up the God phone and go, God, we need you here. We're in a dreadful situation. Come down and sort this out. And God zooms into the rescue. You could read through the other three accounts. You could think, well, they got into all sorts of trouble, and then they called on God. In came God. God sorted it out for them. Great. God is this character who'll come in and sort out the mess that I've got into. Well, God's love is much greater than that, is what we're seeing in this fourth story, because God hasn't simply waited on the end of a phone for someone to call him and to say, I need you. God has come in and raised the stormy wind, lifted the waves of the sea. God's wondrous works in the deep begin at the start of this storm for the lives of these sailors. And as they look back at what God has done hasn't started at the moment when they cried to him, but the first thing that God has done is made them realize their need of him, hasn't it? They went to sea with no thought of God. If that storm hadn't happened, what would have been the story of these men? Well, they'd have travelled from A to B, they'd have sold their wares, they'd have bought some more, they'd have travelled back, they'd have sold those, they'd have made a lot of money, they'd have retired, they'd have a lovely retirement, they've died, and they wouldn't have known anything about God. They would never have called on him in trouble. They'd never have been rescued by him. They'd never have known God's steadfast love or his wondrous works to the children of man. God's love to them begins in that storm. What would happen to John Newton if God had not brought that storm, if you like, off the coast of Ireland? Well, who knows, but maybe he'd have carried on slave trading the rest of his life, quite happy and contented in his own control over his life and his own power over others. God's love began in that storm. Which brings us on to the third thing here. How do the redeemed people, the people God's redeemed, how do they respond? How do they respond? And there's two things really. They thank him and they tell people about it. If you go back to the beginning of the psalm, this is how it starts, isn't it? Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. You start by giving thanks to God. And let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. Of course, the refrain that goes all the way through the psalm is this: let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. And that's the same verse as you have in each of these four stories. Start by giving thanks to the Lord for his steadfast love and his wondrous works. But of course we know a bit more about what God's wondrous works look like now in this fourth story. God's wondrous works are not simply his deliverance. They saw the deeds of the Lord and his wondrous works in the deep before he commanded and raised the stormy wind, saying, give thanks to God. Thank God for the storm. Thank God for the storm. And thank God for his steadfast love to the children of men. Let them thank him. But also here in this fourth story, it's time for them to speak about what God's done. Thank God for what he's done for you. Speak about what he's done to others. Verse 32, let them extol him in the congregation of the people. Let them speak out about him where the people gather together. And praise him in the assembly of the elders. Go to the place where all the important people are getting together and say to them, God's amazing. God is great. Look at what God has done for me. These people have a story to tell, don't they, when they get back to land, back to their shipping offices or wherever they're based. They have a story to tell about what happened in the storm, about weakness and the hopelessness that they felt. And at the same time, how they cried to God. God heard them, God answered them, and God brought them safely to where they were trying to get to. They were able to sell their wares and get back again because God heard them and answered them. And so the psalmist simply says this, let them tell the congregation about that. Let them speak to the people about what God's done. Let them praise God in the assembly of the elders. There's no need for them to hush that story up. Instead, there's a need for them to tell others about the story of God's love and of his wondrous works. That's the same for us, isn't it? The lesson for us is really the same as for these people. We have all been part of a story, maybe not one of these four, but whether we went to the sea in ships or we wandered in deserts, if you're a Christian today, you have been saved when you called out to God. Right, that's very simply what being a Christian is. Right? A Christian is someone who has called out to God and has been saved. Exactly as these four sets of people have experienced. Whatever the reason was that you called out to God to be saved, whatever the situation you were in, if those verses that again are repeated again and again are true of you, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble and he delivered them from their distress, then you can do two things, right? You can thank the Lord for his steadfast love and his wondrous works to the children of man. And that's where you have to start. Right? If we start to go, well, look how greatly I've been saved, you start to end up pointing at yourself, right? My salvation is wonderful. Look at my faith. Look how great I am. Thank God for his steadfast love and his wondrous works to you. And then secondly, let them extol him in the congregation of the people, where people are gathered together. Speak about God's greatness, speak about God's love to your family, to your friends, to the people who come around to your house, to your colleagues if you're at work, to the people down your street. Speak about God's greatness, speak about his love, and you can tell the story of how you were saved, of how you were a sinner, of how you ignored God, or perhaps you felt like some of the people in these different stories. Perhaps you felt that you were in affliction and irons, or perhaps you felt that you were foolish in your sinful ways, but perhaps you simply paid no attention to God at all. But God somehow got your attention, and God somehow caused you to call out to him for salvation. And when you did that, he answered you, and he saved you, and he cared for you, and he showed you his love. You can point them to the greatest example of God's power and his love together in Christ, can't you? Your Lord, who died for you while you were still a sinner because of his love for you, and through his power has saved you and has brought you into his kingdom. So you have great reason to extol him in the congregation of the people and to praise him in the assembly of the elders. And the reason for that is partly because it's for his glory, but it's also for the good of those people, because it doesn't need to take a storm. That's part of the message of this story. It doesn't need to take a storm for those people's colleagues back at the shipping offices. They don't need to wait till they go to see themselves and nearly sink to realize, I think that there is a God, and I think this God has something to do with me, and I think I'm powerless before him, and I think I need to call out to him. The point is that when these sailors go back home and they tell their friends what's happened to them, those friends too can call out to God for salvation, because they'll realize that they need to know this God who is so much greater than they are. It doesn't need to take a storm. So, this short story in this psalm is a very relevant story to each of us, I think. We may not be sailors, but we've all been in a position, we know other people in a position, where we thought God was irrelevant, where we were quite happy in control of our own lives. If you're a Christian here today, at some point that illusion's been shattered. God's steadfast love has broken through into your life so that you've called out to him for mercy and he's answered you. If he's done that, then thank him and tell of his greatness and his love to others.